Thank you very much for coming here tonight. I hope that over the next 30, maybe 35 minutes, I can tell you a little bit about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in this particular area, which is the physical effects of mental illness. A recent report by the OECD, published just last week or the week before, looked at life expectancy across a number of different countries. And Ireland did pretty well in terms of how long we live. It's about 80.6 years. In terms of sex, women just do better than men, just about everywhere. You live longer than we would, and that's not a huge surprise. Before we go on to serious mental illness, I want to use my particular definition of it, and this is fairly well accepted, which is, for me, serious mental illness would be schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression. It does encapsulate many more illnesses, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to try and focus on these three illnesses, and in particular on schizophrenia. As a matter of interest, I can't leave the podium, so I was going to walk around and just try and get some feedback from all of you. But what do you think is the life expectancy of any patient who's got a serious mental illness? Any numbers come to mind? 70? 60? Somebody said normal, which is, let's say, in this context, in Irish context, is 80. So 60, 70, 80?
Generally less than normal.
Generally less than normal, okay. If we look at 3 Scandinavian countries, and they've looked at a 10-year period, people with a serious mental illness tend to live between 20 and 15 years less than expected. So we don't have the same data for this country, but if we assume it's the same, it will be about 60 years for men and about 65 for women. If you take the 3 illnesses that I mentioned earlier, schizophrenia appears to be the worst in terms of life expectancy, and again, there's a divide in terms of sex. Patients with schizophrenia live between 18 to 16 years less than expected. If you've got bipolar disorder, this is also termed manic depressive illness, your life expectancy can be reduced by between 13 and 12 years. In depression, it's reduced by 5 years, and there doesn't seem to be the sex divide that there is between bipolar schizophrenia and depression. That report, Health at a Glance by the OECD, which was published just a few weeks ago, indicated that the excess mortality from either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder was increased 2 to nearly 9-fold in the countries that they studied. If we look at the UK, which may be comparable to Ireland, the rates of those with serious mental illness in terms of life expectancy is 3-fold higher. So the rates of death are higher 3-fold in the UK, and you could say they might be similar over here. So, anyone guess as to why people with mental illness die young? Antipsychotic drugs. Sorry. Suicide.
Chronic stress.
Stress, chronic stress. Lifestyle. And other medical conditions. Okay. Let's talk about suicide first of all, and injury. Suicide, if you like, is the single commonest cause of death in schizophrenia, for example. It is about 40%. And just over 9 out of 10 people who do commit suicide are either depressed or may have been addicted to illegal substances. If we again look at this OECD report, which did include Ireland, and in particular looked at the trends across a number of years within Ireland, and the bottom slide shows this trend, and the arrow, the blue arrow, is always us. We're slightly below the average if you look at the bottom slide, it's the bottom piece of the slide, and again, we're slightly in the middle, or we're not too bad in terms of suicide rates. There's never a good in terms of suicide, But if you look at us internationally, we're just beneath half. But whatever you say about the causes of death within schizophrenia, it's a life-shortening illness. And by and large, if you look at the US, people with schizophrenia live between 25 to 15 years less than expected. And natural causes, such as heart disease, as you heard from Dr. Byrne, account for 2/3 of this excess mortality. Anyone like to finish the caption? Excellent. Like some people, most people in the room, I enjoy this too. But in Ireland, 1 in 400, or 10,000 people, die of heart disease, making it the most common cause of death within this country. It accounts for 1/3 of all deaths within our land. We saw a drop in heart disease-related deaths by nearly 50% over a 15-year period. And nearly half of this reduction was because we decided not to smoke. We decided to lower our cholesterol. We decided to look after our blood pressure. This is a very bad attempt at me trying to do stop animation. So do people think that the mortality gap in schizophrenia or bipolar disorder is increasing over time, and wait for the flash of genius, or decreasing? What do we think? Do we think that over the last 20 years that people with schizophrenia have seen a comparable decrease in their rates of death like we have, or has it gone up or stayed steady? There's only 3 options. What do you think? Stayed steady, gone up, unchanged. Okay. The gap is actually growing. And it's been growing steadily over 20 years. It's only partly because the general population has decided to look after itself a bit more. So there may be other reasons as to why people with schizophrenia die of these natural causes. And again, this study, which was very fortuitous for me, being published just last week or the week before, shows something quite remarkable. Ireland, again, is the blue arrow, and you'll see that our rates of death due to ischemic heart disease has reduced by 59%. That's pretty remarkable over the period of time that they studied. There was a similar reduction in terms of death by stroke as well in the general population within Ireland. But the excess mortality in schizophrenia due to heart disease seemed to increase in most countries that were studied, except in New Zealand. The excess mortality from bipolar disorder seemed to decrease over the 10 to 11-year period that they studied. This was a terrific study done by a colleague in the UK who had access to this amazing database called the General Practice Research Database. And he looked at about 40,000 people with serious mental illness, like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression. And he looked at about 300,000 people who had no mental illness. And what he found was that the majority of sample had schizophrenia in terms of a mental illness. About a quarter had bipolar disorder. But the risk, the hazards ratio of dying from a stroke or from a myocardial infarction was higher compared to the population that didn't have a mental illness. So it's a worrying trend. A good study in Australia showed that over an 18-year period, that ischemic heart disease was the major cause of death in those with schizophrenia. And this rate of dying continued undiminished despite the fact that Australia embarked on a major campaign of primary prevention with respect to heart disease, like smoking, diet, exercise, cholesterol, blood pressure, etc. So the risk factors for heart disease are divided into what are called non-modifiable, things you can't change, so your age, your sex, if you've got a family history of heart disease, and you've got modifiable ones. And again, forgive the cartoons or the pictures, but they're an easy way to get across concepts. So on the left, we'll talk about stress or illnesses. On your right, we'll talk about smoking, blood pressure, diabetes, eating the wrong foods perhaps, and not doing much exercise. These are all modifiable. So again, this study showed that in Ireland, with a reduction of smoking by about 12%, which seems pretty good, except when you compare it to other countries that have reductions of 47%. This is a great series of things that was done in a recent newspaper, The Guardian, and I just thought for the fun of it we might talk about numbers, the numbers that govern our lives. Does anyone know what this number refers to? 2000. Say again?
The millennium.
The millennium, yeah, it does. Calories, yeah. I think the giveaway might be all the bits of food that are stuck between the numbers. Does anyone know what a calorie actually is? I'm not saying I do. I'm saying, does anyone know what a calorie is? Energy, right. And does anyone know where this number came from? The Daily Mail? Yeah, yeah. I mean, the calories, there's at least 5 different definitions of the term calorie. And basically, it's the amount of energy per thing. Let's say food, for example, because that's what we're interested in at the moment, calories, food calories. You can define it in lots of different ways. And these numbers, in a sense, 2,000 for women and 2,500 for men, it's hard to know how people came up with these numbers, really, because when you think of what you need in terms of calories, most of your calories are used by what's called, big term, basal metabolic rate. This is basically breathing, right? Sweating, sleeping, digesting food, your heart beating, your organs working. So 2/3 is done in this very passive way, if you like. The other third is when you fidget, walk, stand up, etc., etc. And it's very difficult to calculate how many calories you need, but the best explanation I heard about this was if you can buy a scale and the scale says it's too much, you're probably eating too many calories. And this was by a nutritionist in the States called Marion Nestle, who is well worth looking up, and her book is well worth reading. And Nestle is like the Nestle that makes all the food, so I think it's kind of ironic. 5? Great. This number came up in 1994. The WHO at the time said, or realized, that we weren't eating enough fruit and said everybody needs to eat about 400 grams of fruit. Greece said, and Denmark said, in fact, we think you need to eat 600 grams of fruit. So now you have 2 numbers, 400 and 600. They're big numbers. So what agency said was, well, let's make it really simple. People like round numbers. We make it 5. We'll eat 5 fruit and veg, and that should be enough. There's no evidence to suggest that 5 fruit and veg is enough for a person. It very much depends on the rest of their diet. So some people would say you need to eat 10 pieces of fruit a day. And some people would say that juicing, which I'm just getting into, is terrific, but you lose all the fiber content of the fruit. So does that really count in one way? So what I'm trying to say is that these are numbers that we automatically think are correct because somebody said that they are, but I'm just trying to get you to question these numbers as I'm trying to get you to question why people with mental illnesses die young. We've spoken about risk factors, and let's see which one of these risk factors may be true. But before I go, 14 verses 21? Yeah. Okay. And again, it's hard to know why these numbers came about, but the current thinking is what people began doing when they realized that they could drink 21 units if they were a man was what? Yeah. And that's really bad news for all sorts of reasons, but really is bad news from your body's perspective. So now it's 2 or 3 a day if you're a woman maximum, or 3 or 4 if you're a man maximum. But I don't know if you'd indulge me, but I thought we'd try a little experiment in terms of alcohol and units. Does everybody understand what a unit of alcohol is? Well, what's a beer? If a pint of beer is how many units of alcohol? 2. And a glass of wine? Okay. Would somebody indulge me in, I can kind of leave the stage for a minute if I shout really loud, and just help me, how much, who would like to come up and pour me, I wish it was wine, but it's water, pour me a pretend glass of wine if I was coming to your house for dinner? So you like me, you want to make me feel comfortable, you're going to be decent. How much wine would you give me? Who's going to, would anybody like to try it? Oh, somebody try it. Come on, I can't do everything. I can't actually leave this bit. Thank you very much. A clap. There's a jug, and there's a glass, and if you could just pour what you think.
I like you.
Thank you very much. And though I don't know you, I like you too for coming up. Okay. Thank you very much. That's from you. Would anybody else like to try this? That's all it requires. Thank you very much. One more person. Come on, I need 2 people to make it really work. Will you? Oh, thank you very much. So you don't mind pouring what you think to be a decent amount of wine into that glass?
It does differ.
So, which is why she's hesitating.
No, I'm hesitating because in France the rule is to the curve of the glass.
Okay.
In a restaurant the rule is a centimetre below, but I know that it's a lot smaller.
So are these glasses normal wine glasses, or are they a bit teensy?
These are small, these are white wine glasses. I would say about that much.
She knows a lot about wine, and
yeah, a little bit less than what he poured I was aiming for.
I must talk to you later about the different wines. So this is a very crude way of trying to estimate how much wine. So technically 1 unit of wine is 110 mils. Now, the RCSI very kindly gave me a measuring jar, and I should have been more specific. I thought being a uni where I didn't study, but I mean, we're all the same, I thought they might have deeper measurements down to 50, but it's only to 200. That's okay, let's have a look. The first person, I mean, guesstimating it, you did pretty well. It's about 150 mils, so that's not bad. The lady, you did spot on. That was just about the right. That, in fact, is 1 unit of wine, roughly. Now, I know it looks terrible, right? Yeah, but that is a unit of wine. So it's interesting people's perceptions of what they pour and then what they claim to be a unit. And if you're at home, do the units get bigger or smaller as the evening goes on? I'm going to see if something works here. I don't know how to get the trackpad. Is there a trackpad? So I'm just used to a Mac, and this sounds terrible. Oh, there you go. Do you want to see a very short video, 2 or 3 minutes, from drinkaware.uk? I think it's really good. I think it kind of puts into perspective alcohol, body size, sex, units, food. Would you indulge me? Yes. Great. Okay. So see, it's just there if you go anywhere near there. So, can you hear that? No. Ah. No? Can you hear that or not? Okay, so anyone who couldn't hear it, it's called drinkaware.co.uk, but it's actually really good. It's kind of truthful. Okay. Does anyone know what this equation means? Someone might.
Gibbs law of free energy.
Gibbs law of free. Everybody says that's brilliant. And the rest of it?
It's like entropy and the rate of design.
Okay. So basically, this is the second law of thermodynamics. And when I understood what this meant, and I didn't understand the equation, by the way, I understood it in terms of a very simplistic way, which is this. What we put in minus what we take out, and you can't see it, but it says drive-through weight loss clinic. So let's say it's exercise, is equal to what we're left with. And if you like, these cartoons show something quite interesting from a sociological perspective. On your left, you're seeing portion sizes of food over a 60 or 70 year period. And the one thing to notice is that they've increased. But what's also increased is the energy density of food. So an average piece of food in general contains more calories or more energy than it used to before. About 70 or 80 years ago, this was a good thing, because most people, irrespective of where they lived, were not on the brink of starvation, but were certainly hungry. So producing large amounts of food that was energy dense was a great idea. But of course, we have the law of unintended consequences, and that's what's happening. We have loads of food. We do little to get the food, or we do little in terms of exercise these days. So it's not surprising, if you like, that we're left with a surplus, which is weight. I put this up because patients with mental illnesses are subjected to the same temptations of food and the same temptations of not exercising that you and I are. So food plays a vital role, perhaps, in why people with mental illnesses may develop heart disease. Our genes haven't changed. Our genes haven't changed so quickly. Society has changed within 150 years, but our genes are still telling us, eat when you can, because you don't know when the next meal might come along. That's called a thrifty gene hypothesis, and it's quite valid today. But what about obesity in Ireland? Well, the rates of obesity are relatively high, with about 20 to 25% of the population being obese. There's been an increase in obesity over the last 11 years. And again, as we're talking about obesity, I thought it'd be good to kind of look at three ways of looking at obesity. And I wanted to maybe do an exercise with the next slide where I'd get you to tell me what you thought was a myth. And I've given you a definition of a myth. These are beliefs that are held true despite substantial evidence to the contrary. Presumptions are unproved yet commonly held propositions. And facts are propositions for which there's enough evidence to say, well, that's true. So I'm going to put up a number of statements, and all I want you to do when I read the statement out is tell me whether you think it's a myth, a presumption, or a fact. Would you be willing to do that? Great. Breastfeeding is protective against obesity. Fact. Okay, I'm going to tell you what's what at the end. Is that okay? I'll remember what you said. So that's fact. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Setting realistic goals in obesity treatment is important, otherwise patients will become frustrated and lose less weight. What do you think? Presumption. Oh, there's a bit of dissent. Facts. How many people think it's a fact? Great. How many people think it's a presumption? Well, that's kind of evenish. So we'll go 50-50 on that. Regularly eating breakfast versus skipping it is protective against obesity. Now, there was a few presumptions, but mostly facts. Can I go with fact as being the overwhelming answer? Great. Snacking contributes to weight gain, obesity. Snacking. Myth, presumption, fact. Okay, how many people think it's a myth? Great. Fact. Yeah, there's fewer of you. And presumption? Same, but I think myth gets that one. I'm not going to remember all this, but we'll continue anyway. Regardless of weight, increasing exercise improves health. Well, I heard one presumption, but I heard mostly facts. Okay. Diets do reduce weight. Myth? Myth, presumption. Okay. The first two are myths. There's absolutely no evidence suggesting they're correct. I've kept it very easy for myself because I wouldn't remember it otherwise. The middle two are, what do you think? Presumptions. Regularly eating breakfast first and skipping it there's no evidence to say that you won't become obese if you eat a regular breakfast. And the same thing, snacking, it really doesn't make a difference in terms of obesity. Yeah? The last two are facts. You can be overweight technically, like your body mass index, but you can be incredibly fit. Did anybody read the story in the Irish Times about the Irish swimmer whose specialty is swimming very long distances and in Arctic waters? Okay. With all due respect to her, you couldn't say that she was slim and trim like, you know, the swimmers that do the Olympics. But she's incredibly fit. Yeah? Okay. And believe it or not, if you do go on a diet, and if you do stick with the diet, you will lose weight. But the problem is most people don't stick with it, so they don't lose weight, so they say diets don't work. The diets work, we just don't stick with them. Okay, let's move on anyway. Well, all fat is not equal, no matter what you're led to believe by anybody. There are generally two body shapes, and again, forgive me if I'm preaching something that you already know. We have lower body fat, which is found more commonly in women, and we have upper body fat, which sadly is found more commonly in men. Upper body fat is also called abdominal fat or abdominal obesity, okay? And if you like, it's much more sinister. And we'll explain why in a minute. Some years ago, I began to get interested in why people with mental illnesses develop just other illnesses like heart disease. And one place I thought of looking was actually the abdomen. This is a CAT scan. The top is the front and the back is the spine. That kind of crescent-shaped thing at the back is your spinal cord. Everything that you see that's white is abdominal fat. Oh, great. That's all abdominal fat. Does anybody know how much a 70-kilogram man has in terms of abdominal fat? I just love the word 70-kilogram man because everybody uses it, so I love using it too. 70-kilo man, how much abdominal fat do they have in their body? Oh, you have to give me a number. Not a lot doesn't help me. 25 kilos. Talk about kilos. 25 kilos. Anything on 25. I feel like an auctioneer here. 13 or 30? 1-3. 18, 10, 20. It's 2. It's a tiny amount. That little piece of fat has huge effects, so that's the key. So we asked this question, do patients with schizophrenia have too much bad fat, too much abdominal fat, too much of this stuff here? So we measured it using these scans. And this study was done when I was in the UK. I just finished my PhD and I was looking for something to do. And this presented itself because the radiologist was very keen to do something. And we found that they had very large amounts of this intra-abdominal fat. In fact, they had 3 times as much, 3.5 times as much. The problem with this study was that our patients with schizophrenia were heavier than our controls, so they weren't matched. Okay, so I came back to Ireland and we redid it. And it didn't make a difference really, because even though we matched all the patients in the usual way, they still had 3 times as much fat in the wrong place. So I can't quantify it because it was a CAT scan, but they had 3 times as much as matched control subjects from a scientific perspective. So they had too much. We also did the same thing in depression, and they had twice as much. And if you've got bipolar disorder, no one's done the study with CT scans, but they're generally believed to be overweight or obese, and centrally so. Visceral fat, intra-abdominal fat, upper body fat, apple-shaped fat, whatever you want to call it, plays a critical part in the development of type 2 diabetes, which is another risk factor for heart disease. Visceral fat, even though it's tiny when it begins, if it becomes large enough, almost becomes like an organ by itself. It begins to produce all sorts of inflammatory markers. It begins to produce the stress hormone cortisol, for example, and does bad things to your body. But one thing is type 2 diabetes. So again, this study by the WHO looked at 52 countries, 250,000 people, and said, do people with mental illness have higher rates of type 2 diabetes or not? And they said, well, yes, they do. But what was really interesting was that these rates were there despite the fact that they had a diagnosis, despite the fact that they'd used medication, had been depressed, had bad lifestyle things, or despite the fact that they may have come from a very poor country or they're poor themselves. So something else was driving this, we felt. So again, having returned fresh from the UK and full of energy, I thought, well, why don't we look at whether people with schizophrenia who have never had any medication and who are having their first episode of illness actually have any risk factors for diabetes. So impaired fasting glucose is simply a high glucose level after you've fasted overnight, whereas glucose tolerance is you come in fasting, we take a blood sample, we give you 75 grams of Lucozade, and we take another sample 2 hours later. And what we're looking for is to see how much your glucose rises. And we found that patients with schizophrenia, 15%, 1 in 6, had impaired fasting glucose, which is a pre-diabetic state. We found that the relatives of patients with schizophrenia who did not have schizophrenia had 18% of them had impaired glucose tolerance, whereas 10% of patients had it. So they were pre-diabetic. So the sibling data would make me think that there's some genetic link between them, or perhaps environmental link, as in shared environment. It's not that different in people with depression or bipolar disorder. The rates of diabetes are higher in both depression and bipolar disorder as well. I think when we first mentioned why people with mental illnesses develop heart disease, somebody said antipsychotic drugs. And if we look at what's happened with respect to side effects of antipsychotic drugs, the earlier compounds were associated with neurological side effects such as extrapyramidal symptoms, that's EPS, or tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement of the face. The newer drugs, so some of the newer drugs have got metabolic problems like diabetes, weight gain, high glucose, etc. So there's been a shift in terms of the side effect profile between new and old drugs. Dave Allison was one of the first to basically get all the different drugs and say, well, which one of them causes the most weight? It was a very bad study, but it got a really good publication and is often cited. And certain drugs like clozapine and olanzapine cause lots of weight gain, whereas placebo and, let's say, ziprasidone causes very little weight gain or no weight gain at all. Again, going back to that GP research database study, Dave showed that the risk of heart disease was threefold higher in those under 50. These are people who died of heart disease. That's quite remarkable. Both sexes are affected. Now we know that in a general population, women are slightly less likely to get heart disease than men. Smoking, social deprivation didn't explain it. They had an increased risk of lung tumors. And even though the use of antipsychotics may have been associated with heart disease, never using them was worse. And there was no increased risk with the newer drugs, the atypical drugs, even though they cause these metabolic disturbances. Now we know that people with mental illnesses have risk factors for developing heart disease. They develop risk factors of heart disease and die from illnesses at higher rates than expected. The life expectancy can be up to a quarter of 100 years, 25 years less than for you and I. They do have unhealthy lifestyles. 95% of people with schizophrenia smoke, for example. And the studies that we've done, we've shown that people with schizophrenia don't exercise as much and have poor dietary choices. They eat fat foods and they take less fiber, for example. Some medications may increase the inherent risk of developing obesity. There's no doubt about that. And not all obesity is the same. And I'm nearly finished. But what happens when patients with serious mental illness present to us? Very few people get treatment early on, be it for lung problems or heart problems. It doesn't actually matter. Patients present late. So if you look at studies, patients present to A&E more so than outpatients with respect to these illnesses. And we as physicians don't really detect these illnesses as often as we should, even though we know that the sicker somebody is from a mental health perspective, the more likely they are to actually get a physical problem. So, if you like, there's a dance between all the different P's, the patient, the physician, and the prescribed medication. I think last slide. In my opinion, we need to raise awareness of this problem, and forums such as this, I suppose, allow us to do so. Surveillance, fancy term, it just means screening. Anybody with a serious mental illness deserves to be screened for heart disease. Standards of care. If you have a mental illness, you should be given the same guideline determined standard of care that anybody else should get as well. And lastly, an integrated service. Doctors of one profession need to talk to doctors of another profession much more often than they are at the moment. It may appear as if I have done most of this. I really haven't. I've cited lots of other people. The biggest thank yous from me are to patients and staff at the hospital which I work, which have allowed me to do this. I've had loads of collaborators, and just to show Kevin, I'm not shy of collaborating with different institutions. We've gone everywhere from RCSI to TCD to New York, and now we're going to UCC as well, just for a different flavour. But thank you very much for your kind attention. If you have any mental illness, I'd recommend that you go and get a healthy heart check done on an annual basis.
I thought that the lecture was excellent. I thought the speaker was brilliant and it was really interesting, and I thought that it was great to kind of, get information about the physical effects that can occur from a mental illness, because usually I think things are so segregated. When we discuss mental illness, we only discuss the mental effects and just how stress or various kind of elements of mental illness can result in it having a physiological effect in a physical sense. Was great to kind of integrate both together. And I'm a big advocate for promoting more information and help for those who suffer with mental illness.